Hello guys, it's Ryan here with Hobbies of Man once again, and today we're doing another book review. We're looking at Battle Mage Farmer Book 2 called Germination. This is again by Seth Ring, published by Atheon Books. The demographic here is adult, and genre-wise I would call this a cultivation novel instead of, you could just call it a progression novel I guess, but I would consider it primarily a cultivation novel, although it has some game-lit elements here. And it's a slice of life, it's a fantasy story. And I would also consider this kind of a Western or maybe a frontier story, if you want to call it that, since it doesn't really have like Native Americans and gunslingers, right? It has a bit more of a medieval vibe to it. So Western doesn't necessarily work, but it is kind of like a story about living on the frontier, right? So whatever you want to call that, that's what this is. It doesn't have an adaptation yet, although there is going to be a light novel edition of this story published sometime next year, I think in March. Like I mentioned in the last video, I have contacted Vault Comics to ask them about it, but I have not received any, messages back. So we'll see if I can get some copies of it to do a video on or not. But it's no big deal. Ratings-wise, it's a 5 out of 5 for me, and premise-wise, basically this is the story that focuses on developing Ellie as a character mostly, and on getting John and Ellie to start doing their farmer business beyond just farming, right? It's about getting them to sell their wheat and stuff, and it actually explodes the world a bit more. It gives it much more breadth to it. It makes it wider, and it's pretty interesting. And a lot of the Western vibes kind of start here, right? Like I think of this story as like what happens after Hondo and the girl in that story move on to living in wherever it is that they go to at the end of that novel, and it gives me a lot of that vibe because of what happens in this book, right? Yeah, anyway, let's get started here. So in the plot, we start with the first set of wheat failing. It's not actually edible for humans because the plants can't process the mana. So it's perfectly edible for animals, right? Since they find a way to expunge mana from their bodies, but humans can't do that naturally. So it means that this wheat that he planted, this first batch of test wheat that he planted, is not edible. But thankfully, he didn't only do that. He planted normal wheat as well, and then he planted a special crop of it where he was going to flood it with mana, right? So it's not a complete loss. He does get some wheat that he can use. He looks at his doom points. They're not that bad at this point. They're at 73 out of 100. So he has quite a long while before the apocalypse comes. But he's still worried about it, right? It's been about 8 months since the last book, or at least since the start of the last book, because it's been 8 months since he got to the farm, and the farm looks great. He has a new worker called Evan who helps him deliver their cheese. We get introduced to him as they all sit down to eat breakfast together. Later, John goes to visit Ferdy and finds that Ferdy is taking care of the mana plant, and it has a circulation system. It can control mana to an extent. And so this actually surprises John and makes him think about his quest, right? And as he's reacting to this, he gets a new quest. It activates, it's called Discover the Secret of Intelligence, and it talks about the fact that John has discovered he has two animals that are more intelligent than they should be, and he has a plant that doesn't act like a plant. He has to trace its roots back to the center to see what the hell's going on. And so this is going to be the main plot line that happens in the background for the rest of the book, right? So he asks Ellie for help about this. Does she know anything about plants? Does she know anything about plants that can control mana? And basically she doesn't, because even though she has a better education than most people in this world, she is not that knowledgeable because of circumstances in her life, right? They start talking about traveling to Kingsmouth, Kingsmouth, which is basically the nearest city to them, in order to do a few things, right? They want to go find Ellie's grandmother's mansion or manor, which is somewhere in the outskirts of Kingsmouth. They have to go sell their wheat, and they have to do a few other things, but I can't remember exactly what they are. As they're kind of deciding this, John asks her about her class ceremony. Does she want to finish it? And Ellie initially hesitates for a bit, but she thinks about her last ceremony, and she decides that she does want to go through it. She wants to finally be a witch and connect with her grandmother through that idea, right? And so she gathers up her resolve, and she agrees to do it next week when a storm comes, because that's what they've decided her medium is, right? And they go over the process once more so that we know what the process is. And basically, it basically has two components to it. One, the class ceremony has to be started. Her grandmother, the witch, previously did the first step, which is to create a mana circulation system within Ellie's body and give it an initial boost of mana, which starts the ceremony. But because they chose the wrong medium for her, they failed to finish it. However, at this point, Ellie has grown beyond that mana, and she needs to find her medium properly, or she might die when she tries to finish the ceremony. So through some calculations and some thought process, they have decided that Ellie's medium is the storm. And so when the next storm approaches, they will go and finish her ceremony, which basically just means she has to suck in storm mana and create a vessel for herself inside of her body and start to circulate it, which basically means that she is a jar and she has to fill it with storm mana, if that makes sense. And in order to do this, John gets Ellie to read this book called The Basic Arcanum, which is the book that he found at the end of the last book. Later, John wonders about spell scrolls and the creation of them, and he asks Mental Model if it can tell him how to do it, but because it's based on his knowledge, it doesn't actually have an answer because it can't use anything to extrapolate how to do it, right? Mental Model is, I guess, AI system, right? Or a supercomputer that manages to condense data using John's brain. And John and Ellie discuss mana at this point and its elemental effects, even though John knows that those elemental effects are just for show. They're not actually, defining of the mana in the world. All mana is technically attributeless, and then it's channeled by a person, and then it's given an affinity, right? Or at least that's what it seems like. It's kind of unclear, actually. But John says that it is neutral, that it always works the same way. Later, John and Thomas discuss the wheat harvesting, and John gets annoyed at the fact that it's going to take forever because he has to do it by hand. He has to use a scythe, and then someone has to go and pick up the cut pieces behind him. And so what he decides to do is build himself a harvester, right? He has general knowledge of how farming works here in the modern world. He understands that there's machines that pick up, the plants after they've been cut. And he has engineering knowledge based on the fact that he had to work on the siege engines that they used in the war when he was fighting, right? So using that basic level of engineering skills and the fact that he knows that these machines can exist, he starts planning them and he creates this harvester. He goes to the Keller farm to go into the smelter and the mine there, and he works on this creation by manhandling the components into shape, right? Because he doesn't have any tools. Finally, he decides to assemble it, and he comes home, he greases it up with Ben, and they start testing it, and he fiddles with it to make it work perfectly. With some mana-assisted drawing, they manage to finish the first wheat harvest in a week, which usually would take quite a few weeks, right? Like maybe a month and a half or something. Mostly spent on drying time, as far as I understand it, right? Because I'm not a farmer either. But, it does a lot of, like, the story has enough information for you to understand the farming process and what John has to do. So I'm guessing Seth Ring is, some sort of farmer in the Pacific Northwest or something, because that's kind of the setting that we're in. And it's been a week by the end of their harvesting season, and a storm is coming in. Faraday and Sivaldi sense something beyond the storm. They're kind of concerned, and John investigates and finds out that it might be undead. But they aren't coming yet, so he, tells Thomas to take care of it, to watch out for it. And John asks Ellie about, some of the dangers that happen during the storms. And we learn about the stone worm, which is a magic beast that only comes out every 10 years during big storms. And it's just kind of a off-the-cuff kind of thing, right? It's some sort of Chekhov's gun for later. And at midnight that day, after the week has ended, the storm finally rolls in, and Ellie and John go on to complete her ceremony. They go up to a nice hill that John had cleared up earlier in the week, and Ellie takes off her shoes, she takes off her cloak, and starts doing a witch's dance, or a rain dance, if you want to call it that. And John thinks it looks beautiful. She's very energetic. She's not really dancing per se. She's just kind of moving rhythmically to the sound of the thunder and the rain. And it seems like somehow she's mirroring the mana in the air that is creating the storm. And as she does this, she's bringing mana into herself and charging up, and then finally condensing it all and creating herself a mana vessel within her body. And so she has ascended to a class, and she gets the witch class. and she is a storm witch, or a witch that uses the storm medium, and she gets quite a few skills out of it. She activates her true sight, which is whatever the skill she got, and she looks at John and immediately regrets it because John looks like the devil, like under the true sight. And with the fact that John is basically like at the highest level possible, where Ellie is at the lowest level possible, John looks like this sulfuric, nasty fire demon to her, and he constantly has like souls crawling all over him, writhing in pain. Right? She turns off her true sight after John knocks her attention away from him, and she kind of almost falls unconscious. And John manages to tell her, "Hey, you okay? You know, it's just because you saw something with your skill doesn't necessarily mean it's that way, right? So be careful about what you see. Don't worry too much about it, right?" And Ellie, you know, trusts him implicitly, so she goes along with it, and they head home, and they talk a bit more about finding Ellie's house at this point, or Ellie's grandmother's house. And that's kind of it for this part of the story. At this point, we have a bit of a time skip. It's been a day or two, and John goes off to the forest to learn some new spells. First, he learns Summon Water. He immediately starts learning how to use it because he absorbs it, and so he learns how to use it instinctively. He activates it. He sees that it creates beads of water, and he tries to manipulate it using mental model. And he learns a lot about it. Basically, it seems to pull water from a different plane, which is different from the way his fireball spell works. And he learns how to use the principles inside of Summon Water to change the attributes of his fire. And so he is now balancing these fire and water kind of attributes, right? And I think it's funny that John is like slowly becoming like a nature god by accident, just by having a fire affinity and then developing this water affinity later, right? And he practices with it for a few weeks, eventually decides it's time to learn Water Arrow, and again, he gains understanding of it with mental model, analyzes it, and makes fire arrows. And he learns Downpour, which allows him to make rain, and then decides to go visit the Grimm. And at the altar, he sees the Grimm have left him a few gifts this time. They've left him a little mask that looks like a Grimm face that only fits on a child, and a little child-sized dagger that's made basically with infused mana in it. And so it's different than he was expecting, right? These magic items are unexpected, and they don't really lead to anything in this book, but they're nice, so pay attention to them. They will be interesting later on. A few weeks later, Gottfried returns with the caravan, and he brings a load of stuff. He basically brought like 7 or like 12 carts to John's house, and they unload them. They're all of the things that John had requested. You know, he gets a blacksmithing shop out of it. He gets a bunch of meaningful stuff for Ellie and himself. Food, wheat, sorry, not wheat, meats and you know, a bunch of other things. And it turns out that John's cheese has become very popular, mostly with the merchant class, because they decide to hoard it for themselves instead of selling it to nobles. But the nobles are interested in it, so they have a lot of orders that they have to fulfill. And so it's very meaningful business, and Gottfried and John decide to do some more business development by having John pay him a certain amount to create a better distribution network for his cheese. And it's pretty cool stuff. I enjoy this. It's not really meaningful, but it's enjoyable. John decides to unload all of his blacksmithing tools at this point. He realizes that he needs to build a new building. And similar to in the last book, he decides to build it from scratch pretty quickly. He manages to get around to it pretty fast. And as he's getting some more materials for it by finding boulders from the river and taking them home, he finds a body. And he goes to Thomas to ask for help, and they find a few more. So they have 5 bodies. They have to bring them back to town. They report it, and they sit with Sven for breakfast, and they question him about the situation because Sven is a rogue, and they think that a rogue killed his people. But Sven clearly had nothing to do with it, so they let it go. And then John goes to talk to Haver. It's kind of funny that all of the people at Haver's wolf den are afraid of John. They have a quick chat, and he goes home to finish off his blacksmithing shop. Then they load their carts with wheat, and they head out for Kingsmouth. And this is kind of the midway point of the story here. The narration introduces us to the idea of horse bandits, which you could either consider Native American, Mongolian, or maybe kind of like like Arabic horse riders, like the type of people that Lawrence of Arabia kind of dealt with back in the day. Stuff that comes out of Arabian Nights and things like that. And this is right on time to get them to show up into the story, right? But before they do, John and Ellie talk about the way of the world, right? How it is right now. There's an insane, desperate poverty, which seems kind of accurate to the modern world as well. And they talk about the eternal flame. John is kind of a bit awkward about this because he is the eternal flame, but he doesn't like what he stands for because basically death follows him everywhere, right? But the eternal flame is hope and good, right? And so he doesn't know what the hell to to say about this. They stop for the night. Ellie goes to sleep, and later she wakes up John because something is coming, and this is their first fight with the undead. It's kind of crazy. It goes pretty well. John hunts down the necromancer controlling them, and he kills them, and learns that this is an acolyte of his old enemy, Keithoff the Eyeless. And this is kind of the setup for the main bad guy for the next book, which is pretty cool stuff. I quite like it. He kills the acolyte, he gets back on the road, and Ellie and John decide that Ellie wants to fight and that John wants to train her, and so they start, developing some techniques for her. Basically, he first tells her to learn yoga, essentially, some stretches and some motions to get her used to her body because it has changed since she became an awakened being, right, a class holder. And they learn a bit about the necromancer through the stuff that John looted from their body. Later, the horse bandits approach, finally, and actually it turns out that John knows the ways of the horse bandits, of the Moratoi, because he had a blood brother. One of the people that he fought with in the war was a Moratoi and showed him his people's culture. And so John manages to invoke a rite of peace by inviting them to dinner, and then he has a serious conversation with them about the fact that they cannot continue to live this way because they are not actually getting anything out of it anymore. They have to change or die. And John manages to convince them. They seal a pact and they decide to go on peacefully, and they'll decide what to do tomorrow. Later at night, John and Ellie, go out of the camp and they meet with the Moratoi again because the second part of the rite is that they have to fight. They have to fight ritualistically in order to decide if John is going to be part of their band or not. And John manages to win by fighting their leader called Sayat, the Slaying Wind, and fighting him to a standstill. And so the pact is sealed properly at this point. And the next day, the Moratoi are going to escort the caravan and go into Kingsmouth and trade for the first time in their people's history. They gift John and Ellie some horses, which are eventually called Storm and Merlin. Merlin is John's horse and Storm is Ellie's. And they make it to the city, and John uses some of his political acumen to allow the Moratoi into the city at this point. He makes quick work of selling his wheat, and then John and Ellie decide to go find her grandmother's manor. They end up kind of going out of the city, finding this valley, getting into the valley, and are followed by a rogue. John kills him, he loots them, and he realizes that Vasek has sent this rogue, and they find this infinity symbol, which is a symbol that denotes a cult of evil necromancers that are all looking for immortality, right? They fight these crazy spiders, very similar to Harry Potter, when he has to deal with Aragog, and then eventually they finally make it to the manor. They meet Vexus, who is a star djinn, and Ellie's old nurse, basically, or babysitter. He was her grandmother's familiar, I guess is the word to call him. And Ellie goes to the library to get her grandmother's last message, and John also gets to meet her for a moment, and she explains a bit of the history of the world. Back in the day, Beast overran this world. They were about to kill and destroy humanity, and eventually a mage opened a dimensional portal and passed through. He was tasked with saving humans and minimizing the threat that the beast posed, and he brought with him 4 other class holders to help him do this. One of them was the witch, one of them was a ranger, one of them was a rogue, I think, and the other one was some sort of fighter, I think, right? And from these original 5 classes, we get all of the other ones that exist currently in this world, right? And We also learn that each of these original class holders left behind a family legacy, and this legacy was supposed to go to Ellie, but because she's not actually blood related to her grandmother, she cannot possess the legacy. So her grandmother did the next best thing, which is write down some important information for her in an actual journal and pass it down to Ellie. And this is what Ellie is receiving at this point. And John learns that he's immortal, or at least he knew that already, but we learned that he was immortal and that he is different from everyone else in this world, right? And he asks Mental Model to figure out the doom points at this point. They return to Kingsmouth. They have to fight an adventuring team on the way there. They manage to kill them all. They get supplies out of it, and then they get to Kingsmouth. They find more supplies to take home, and then they decide to move on. They stop at a Moratoid camp at this point, and there's a bit of a tense moment where one of the young ladies that is an apprentice to the wise women of the camp, which is the equivalent of a witch in the Moratoid tradition, tries to slip John a love potion. It doesn't work, and the Moritoi think that John's going to kill them all, but he chooses to be merciful and allows them to move on with their lives. And so they continue on home, and they finally get there, and John talks to Thomas about the symbol that he found, and they talk about the infinitum and what it is, and you know what bad things are coming their way. They finally get to rest, and the next day they set up to start the spring planting, and John connects with the mana plant at this point, and he finds its roots. It's in the Shadow Tower, which is the thing that he'd been looking for this whole time, the reason why he went with the adventurers last time, and the thing that he thinks will give him the information he needs to learn about the history of mages in this world, right? Before he manages to go to the Shadow Tower, Ellie decides that she wants to summon a familiar because a storm is coming soon, and so they get everything ready. And when they get around to it, Ellie summons a creature that is way too powerful. It's this weird wind, thunder, storm spirit that takes on the body of this nasty, like, bug alien creature. And they have a crazy fight. It's very cool. Ferdy and Sigvaldi join in, and through a weird set of circumstances, Sigvaldi ends up eating the spirit, catching Ellie's spell, and so becoming her familiar, and in a really funny way. And now Ellie has this awesome Thunderbird as her familiar, and it's pretty fun, although Sigvaldi is pretty stupid. So overall, most of the time, his hijinks are just funny, not necessarily cool, but sometimes he does manage to pull it off, right? So yeah, this ends up being kind of the end for Ellie's journey for now. At this point, she just has to learn to fight better throughout the more experiences. And so we don't really have to focus on Ellie's progression as a witch anymore at this point, because she got all of the basic requirements done, right? So basically the point of Ellie's journey at this point finishes for now, right? We transition over to John, who has called George and Haver to come by to talk about the necromancers and to get them to help him get rid of them. When John hears that there is a noble in town, Earl Vasek has come for whatever reason, and John deals with him kind of roughly. It's not a great way, but John manages to make him kind of angry enough to follow him later on when they go off to spelunk the Shadow Tower. John learns a scrying spell. He recruits Haver to go spelunking with him, and then goes to practice his spells in secret. He learns Raging Waters. He learns to use the Raging Waters to create a fire spell called Twisting Flames, which is kind of like Dragon Twister, right, or something like that, like from Pokemon, or what's it called? I don't know. There's like a fire attack in Pokemon that creates this weird fire vortex around different Pokemon, and it has it deals damage over time, right? So I can't remember what it's called, but it's kind of something like that, right? It's similar to one of Linden's attacks in Cradle as well, right? I think it's what's it called? Which one is it actually? Dragon Dance, right? Something like that. And he also learns to use Dragon's Breath, which is when he manages to shoot dragon fire out of his mouth. But it's different from just normally shooting fire. Like, something about it is special, but I can't remember what it is. He goes to town at this point. He meets up with Ellie and Haver and George and all of these characters, and they learn that Ecclesia has set up has set up an office in the town, and we get introduced to the priestess, whose name is Eva. or Ava. Evangeline Belushi, I think is her name. And she has two holy knights with her. Their names are Hugo. He's a dumb young guy. And we have Marcos, who is an older gentleman. And so after they meet the priestess, Haver and John learn that George is not available to join them on the spelunking, so they get Sven to join them. And we see that Earl Vasek is here again, and well, he's a bit of an ass. And John manages to prod at him, poke at him verbally enough to get him to understand that John has the stuff he wants and to chase him. And John wants to do this for a specific reason. It's kind of unclear what the reason is, but it ends up being for the best, right? So they start heading out to the Shadow Tower. They find the Grimm fighting this giant swarm of insects, and John saves them from it. They establish contact with the Grimm through Ellie's spell work. She has this special ability that allows her to connect with other beings and share language with them. And John gives one of the Grimm a special construct that he like kind of cobbled it together in some way. And this is kind of weird because he doesn't know how to do it, but he somehow managed to do it, and it's kind of unclear how, especially based on what is important in the next book. So I guess I'll talk about it then, or maybe in the book chatter episode that I want to do for the Battle Mage Farmer, right? So we'll see. I guess we'll talk about it later anyways. So the Grimm decide to, or John asks Ellie to ask the Grimm if they can lead them down to the tower. They lead them to this place called, well, it doesn't have a name, but it's kind of like this special area where there's a door that can't be opened, and there's these concerning plants that lead, that activate something, which is these weird things called the Monosuckers or the Guardians or something. And John doesn't really understand what's going on, but he opens the door, and they manage to get into the tower proper at this point. They make it down. They go through this weird, dangerous feeling forest. John gets them to avoid it. They keep going down. They go down a few levels. And as they're halfway down the tower, Earl Vasek catches up to them. And John and the Grimm kill most of his men. And as Earl Vasek was rushing through the tower to get to them, he actually didn't do it carefully. And so he has awoken these mana-sucking beasts that turn out to be these weird plant men. And so they show up and they start killing the rest of Earl Vasek's men. At this point, he gets scared and he decides to use this amulet he has in order to trigger a transformation within himself. And he becomes this creature that I would consider a gargoyle, right? I'm not really sure if other people would think about it like that, but I would consider it a gargoyle. Although they call him a vampire, but he doesn't look like a vampire in my opinion. He looks more like a gargoyle. So I'll just keep up with that, but the term that is used is vampire, right? And, well, everything goes to shit at this point because this thing is very powerful. John's the only one that can fight it, but if he does that, he's going to start developing more Doom points, and so he has to stall it for a little bit as he figures out what to do, and doing this actually makes it target Ellie. So Ellie and Sven have to run off in one direction, and John and Haver end up falling to a different place, and they somehow end up getting dragged by the plant men somewhere, and they end up in a place where John is contacted by the plant thing that he's talking to, and it requires him to power it up. It needs more mana, and John is the highest available source of mana possible in this world, so it requires him, or asks him, requests of him, to power it up. John sees through the vision that the plant is giving him that the place where he has to go is where Ellie and Sven and the gargoyle man, Earl Vasek, are. So he tells them that he needs to go there now, and the plant people move him there as quickly as possible, and John arrives in the nick of time to save Ellie from the gargoyle man, but it has been too late for Sven. The gargoyle was attacking them. He has sent some ghouls and stuff, and they had managed to get rid of most of the ghouls, but Ellie was targeted specifically, and as she was about to be killed, Sven sacrifices himself. His eyes glow blue because he believes in the eternal flame, and he sends himself to his death to save Ellie. Ellie cries in this moment. She gets angry. She attacks Earl Vasek, and she also realizes that John is the eternal flame, which is why Sven sacrificed himself. He believed in the eternal flame. He knew that John was him, and he knew that John cares about Ellie. And if Ellie dies, John also dies, right? Or he becomes harder, or he basically would would get angry and the world would suffer because of it. And so Sven thinks that the right thing to do is to let himself die so that Ellie can survive. And Ellie starts attacking Vasek, and when he's distracted, John manages to incinerate him and kills him and then activates the tower. And it's actually very concerning because John has to use a bunch of his mana and his doom points start racking up, right? And he gets to 98 out of 100, so we barely avoid the apocalypse at this point. Ellie notices that John is having a difficult time, and she hugs him. And as she hugs him, John comes back to himself. He brings himself down thanks to her intervention, and then everyone goes down to meet the plant. It introduces itself as Rebia, the flower of promise, and it's been made by Kelvin's apprentice. John completed his quest to learn about intelligence, and he gets a decrease in his doom points. And John and Rebia discuss the apocalypse, and it's a bit concerning because Ellie and Haver have no clue what the fuck's going on. John and Rebia are talking about things that are very concerning, and John realizes that they're not going to really get anything done. So they come out, they go talk to the Ecclesia to tell them, Sven has died, stuff happened, and then they decide to go home. This is where our main story ends, and we get a bit of an epilogue, I guess you could call it, where we see that Katrine, who is the witch lady that we got introduced to previously, and her favorite Duke Benoit, are dealing with a coup in their country of Valera, and she has to fake her death like John did in order to survive. And this is where the story ends. I thought the plotline was great. I really, really enjoyed it. I think it was a bit more action-packed than before, and I'm liking that through John's quest to save the world, we are learning more about it. My favorite part was also the Mori toy. When I read this, I really got the Hondo vibes because I got to see this world-weary soldier man meet with some special, high-class Native American horse-riding people and interact with them in the ways of them. And I thought it was really cool, right? It was really enjoyable to see that because it's something that I guess works within the context of epic fantasy and fantasy type stories, to have this character that knows the ways of others, and these others being like a race of, or like a group of differently cultured people that have a more value in nature and their rights and stuff. But I feel like it's something that we don't get to see that often. And so I really liked it. It gave me a lot of very like Western style vibes. So I liked it a lot. So yeah, overall, this is a great book. I really had a fun time with it. So in terms of characters, we get John. We get to see that he grows as a mage. He's learning real mage things at this point. He doesn't have to just use magic to survive at this point. He's learning magic as a studious scholar, right? And he has some softening of his heart. He has basically tried to not be human anymore. And Ellie is constantly making him humanize himself a bit more. Ellie gets to get the witch class finally, and she gets Sigvaldi as her familiar. Haver develops himself into a friendly character, a good character for us to bounce off of, which is great. Sven dies, which sucks, and Ben and Thomas have developed a good relationship with each other. They are now master and apprentice, right? With Ben learning how to fight thanks to Thomas. We get introduced to Rebia. We get introduced to Earl Vasek, who's a bad guy. We learned about Cormac, the grain guy, who's friends with Gottfried. And we learned about Sayat and Ongur and a bunch of other Mori toys. And we get introduced to Eva, the Ecclesia priestess that moved into Fairford. And Rebia isn't really a character yet, but I think that it'll be interesting to see more of her going forward because she's not a person, right? She's a plant that has person attributes to it, like its brain is made up of the consciousness of a real person. So is that a real person or not? It's kind of like, it's almost like an automaton, right? But it's also like its own creature, so it's kind of interesting. World building wise, we learned that witches and mages are not the same thing. They work differently. Witches work with natural mana, whereas mages usurp natural mana. They take it out of the cycle and use it for their own gain. And that's actually why magic is dangerous in this world, because mostly mages are the ones using magic, and when they do, they create magical fallout, and this is toxic to people, right? We learned that the mages use elemental affinity, even though it's BS. We learned about class holders and the fact that there's 4 different levels to them, right? There's class holder, titled class holder, legendary class holder, and sage class holder, and whatever John is. And it's an exponential growth, right? So a legendary class holder is not twice as strong as a normal class holder, but is actually like 4 times as strong or whatever it might be, right? There is an exponential growth curve to their powers. And we learned that there was 5 original class holders that were brought to fight beasts. One of them was a mage, and I mentioned the other ones previously, so I won't do it again. We learned about the infinitum, which is the key to everything according to the original mage, but actually is currently now an immortality cult. And yeah, that's basically it world building wise. In terms of art and fan service, there is no art, there is no fan service. There is the development of a romance between John and Ellie that is going to become something meaningful later on, right? And rating wise is a 5 out of 5. I thought it was really fun. I didn't have any issues with any of the world building at this point because we are working towards developing it and getting answers for some of the issues that I had last time. So there really is nothing for me to complain about. So yeah, overall, great stuff. I really loved it. And there really isn't too much else to say. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed and see you guys later.